Hi everyone, welcome to the first video in a series of what I'm kind of calling my pro tips videos. That's pro in definite air quotes, but just going through the really common things that rather than recording each class, because a lot of the discussion in each class is kind of about individual projects and stuff, these are just kind of common things that are going to apply all the time to each class. So I'm kind of breaking them into level 1 and level 2. And I'm going to kind of do them in a bit of a sequence and just kind of going through, basic, so level 1 for Adobe Illustrator 1 classes, and then level 2 for Adobe Illustrator level 2 classes. These things really aren't super advanced. They apply to really almost every file, but it's just about getting into some of the common things if you're brand new to Adobe Illustrator and you just kind of want to get a sense of what you're working with. So this first video here is going to focus on working with color and just generally kind of getting your workspace going whenever you start a brand new Adobe Illustrator file and what Illustrator kind of presents to you by default, depending on which palettes you have open. But I'm just going to kind of go through each of the palettes and discuss sort of what we're looking at here. So I've got my swatches palette open. Now everything that I've got open here is all available under the window menu. If you're on a Mac, it's just a little separate from the actual application window. I'm working on Microsoft Windows right now. But everything, all these palettes, these libraries that I have open here, those are all available from the Windows menu. So the first one that we're really working with is your swatches palette. So this is where you kind of save all your colors and your patterns and your gradients that you're going to be using in your illustration. The next palette that I have open here is the color palette. Okay, so that's color right there. Then I have one transparency, and then the third one here is gradient. And these are on their own, they're kind of the primary ways that you're going to handle your colors and work with your colors depending on the style of graphic you want to put together. These are all going to work together. There's other ways to manage these things, but we'll go through those in sort of more the level 2, but these are the basics. So right out of the gate, when you open up your default Adobe Illustrator, and I'm using CMYK. Now, for if anybody is not familiar with CMYK, that stands for cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. Why they decided to use the K instead of the B, I'll never know. I'm sure there's a good reason, but that's for print. Those are the 4 process color inks that are used in your inkjet printer or in a continuous tone printer in a digital print shop. That's for print. And for most of the time, we are designing for print with Adobe Illustrator. We're not always, but if we're designing for web graphics, that's where RGB comes in. And when we're looking at a screen, we're actually looking at RGB, of course. Your computer screen displays colors using RGB, a mix of red, green, and blue. And you'll notice that the default color palette, when you open it up in Adobe Illustrator, all the color swatches that they give you by default are all RGB mixes. And that might seem okay, except for the fact that we're generally not working for RGB, we're working for print. You kind of want to go from CMYK to RGB because the color gamut, that is the range of colors that are possibly reproducible by CMYK, is a little smaller than what RGB can produce, and that also depends a little bit on your graphics card and your monitor. But CMYK, the range of colors is lower. So out of the gate, the default palette is kind of a little misleading because all these palettes are RGB. And if we double click into a swatch in our swatches library, we see the values and we can edit that color. Okay, so right out of the gate, there's a little bit of a weird thing going on here where RGB red in CMYK is 99.33% magenta and 100% yellow. Now, when we're printing colors out, this percentage represents the screen, or the sort of the number of dots and how much spacing is between each dot that goes down on the paper. Logically, in printing, a rational dot size isn't a fraction of a percentage. It just goes from 0 to 100 in even blocks. And the reason it's converting this way is because it's an RGB red. And if I change the palette to RGB to see what the mixer is, 237, 32, 36. So that's the mix of red, green, and blue on the screen. So Illustrator is kind of estimating how you would get this particular red in CMYK. This is a really intense red. You would never get anything even close to this in print. It will come out much more orangish purple. It'd be pretty red, but it's not going to be as intense as what you see in RGB, and that's where that kind of gamut comes out. So a rational CMYK value would be 100 or 99. But that's, if you're working in CMYK, that's how we want our colors to always be built. And so when we look through this default palette, every color is going to have that problem. Every color is going to be an irrational mix of CMYK for print. So it's kind of a useless color palette to start with because it's defining things out of the gate in a way that's not super accurate. But the other thing that we're going to see is that none of them are set up as global or spot colors. And we want global or spot colors because those are easier to work with if we're tinting something. This color palette here shows me what the mix is for this red color. But as soon as I change a value on it, I'm no longer working with that swatch. I'm now just making an entirely new color, and I can go along and draw a shape in that. But if I don't save it, I can't ever match it up again. So this is where this idea of making global colors comes into play. You click this global palette. Okay, so I'm going to switch this to global, and I'm going to make it 100. And see what happens right up here in the color swatch? Now I can actually tint that color up and down. So that helps, and it also connects this color to the swatch. So if I want to do multiple shapes and I want to switch back and forth, I'm going to be able to click this color and I'm going to know that it's the same red throughout my drawing, and that's, or my graphic, whatever it is I'm working on. And that's generally desirable. Generally you kind of want everywhere a certain color is used, you want it to be the same mix and not just kind of random. Depends on what you're doing, but a lot of times with what we're doing in Illustrator, we're making logos or charts or whatever, so you kind of want your colors to be consistent. So the first thing you want with your spot colors, or your swatches I should say, is you want them to at least be global. But really there's actually one more level that's better than that, and it's more useful in other applications, and that is changing the color type from a process color to a spot color. So when we do that, it doesn't change anything about the way that it's mixed, but it now I'm going to hit OK, and you can see now it's changed here. It's put this little dot in this RGB red, and it's put this dot here. So a spot color tells Adobe Illustrator how to treat that particular color. And we'll get more into this in the level 2, the advanced or more advanced use, when we start to talk about what this attribute here, overprinting, is all about. But really, spot colors are meant to standardize the way inks go down. If you look at any sort of packaging or printing, particularly things like pop cans or beer cans, if you look really closely at how they're printed, and this is actually almost every packaging that isn't paper, you're going to see spot colors at work. And those spot colors are generally, those graphics are generally designed using Adobe Illustrator primarily. So getting comfortable with just using spot colors all the time is preferable, because it gives you the control here, just like as if it was a global color. But one step better is when you import whatever graphic you make using spot colors, like into Adobe InDesign, which is super common, all of those spot colors, as long as they're defined as spot colors, are going to automatically come with the graphic. So they're all going to show up in the palette in Adobe InDesign. And that's really, really useful, because we want our CMYK mixes to match automatically between those things, so that if you're working with a linked graphic between Adobe Illustrator and Adobe InDesign, all your colors that you've defined in your vector graphic in Illustrator are now going to be available for things like type and whatever elements, graphic elements you might introduce in a layout program, which is Adobe InDesign. Basically, it's the only real option. Quark Express is out there in the weeds. I've heard people lurking around with it, but almost everybody's doing their production layout in Adobe InDesign. And that is the main reason we want our graphics to always be using spot colors for our swatches. So that really kind of gets into it, is that your default color swatch, just to save yourself some time. I mean, yeah, I might make myself some colors here just to work with. I'll just stick with a couple of them. But I'm just going to plop a shape down quickly so that I'm using that color. And then I'm going to give myself a blue and a magenta, and I'm just going to keep those. I mean, this is just real basic stuff, but you know, I want this to be 88. And I want this to be 77, and I'm going to call it spot, and I'm going to save it. I mean, it turns it to global, and that's fine. We're just going to call it spot blue. And let's do one more just for the sake of it. Let's maybe we're going to keep this cyan color here too. So spot color 52, 13. That makes more sense as a CMYK mix. So maybe that's just my palette that I want to use there. So I'm going to grab that shape, and then I'm going to pop down one more basic shape to use this one. Okay, so now those colors are all used. They've actually been applied to shapes, and you can see that if I click around like that, it shows me what color is applied to that shape. If I drew some other shapes, and I go through and I apply, you know, this red, orange, yellow, it's gonna show me what those swatches are. But if I happen to then, and this is gonna be really common, you're like, oh, I'd like to lighten this up a little bit, I'm gonna have to now kind of adjust all these values kind of independently, right? And then I'm like, okay, that looks good. But now it's not assigned anywhere in my swatch. It's not a used color. It's just literally independent and only applies to this particular color. Of course, you can go through and sample it and make it match, but that's just going to get messy and difficult to work with in a lot of the kind of applications when we're getting more professional with our graphics. So we just really don't want to be using these default swatch colors. So what I'm going to do is, now that I've just applied a few colors, I'm going to go here to what's called the contextual menu. I'm going to click on that, and I'm going to say select all unused. So it's going to go through and select everything in the swatch that I haven't used, except for some odd reason this grays palette. So I'm going to hold down shift and select that as well. Actually, it's not going to let me do that. I don't know what it is that Adobe Illustrator seems to really love, that grays group, but every time I do this it doesn't delete it. But we're going to then hit this trash can. We're going to delete all those swatches, and I'm going to delete these too. Okay, so then this is a more workable palette. It's kind of clean. I mean, I'm going to add new colors as I go, but really all those colors, just to avoid using them, you just want to delete all those default palette colors. You really want your palette to just be made of nothing but global spot colors. You know, we can always convert them to CMYK or RGB or whatever our output is, but we just mainly want them always defined as global spots, because it's just going to work with all of our applications better. Just quickly cover these as well. So, you know, registration, you don't use that very much. You can't delete it. It's used for sort of looser printing situations like silkscreen. If you want to put a custom registration block on there, it basically tells the production people who are using your file to treat anything that's got the registration color as a mark on the graphic to be used for alignment. But most of the time those are defaulted anyways in the output file, so you don't really use the registration graphic in a custom thing very often at all. White, similarly, you can't delete it. It basically represents paper. You can kind of think of anytime you put down white, the assumption is we're printing CMYK on white paper. So when you use white, you're really showing the paper through. But there's situations when we get into more advanced use of color where that wouldn't be the case. As well, black is a color that is part of the CMYK mix. So you'll notice that, let's see, is it going to let me delete black? It is. That's nice. Maybe it's going to let me delete white too. Not that I would really want to do that, but that allows there. So a lot of times what we're going to do is we're going to think about, we don't want to use registration for drawing black. So sometimes you want black lines or whatever. So we're going to make ourselves a new swatch here called rich black. So the reason we make a rich black spot color is we don't just want to put down 100% of black ink, because that's actually going to look pretty gray on continuous tone printers or even on your inkjet printer. It's just going to put down 100% of the black ink only and none of the other ones. But you can generally get a nicer looking black if you add an even amount of the other colors to it, something like 20%. So all those colors are going to kind of mix together to make a richer looking black when you're printing out on your sort of typical desktop printer. So you're defining how much ink gets put down in there, and you can actually tint your black, your rich black. You can make it cool or warm by, you know, increasing cyan, magenta, or yellow. But if you do it all even, it's going to be an evenly toned black. So I'm just going to call that a basic rich black spot color, and that's going to kind of come out more nicely when we're printing it out. So that wraps up working with color number 1, just setting up our basic color palettes. My next video here is going to be sort of part 2 of this video, where we're going to get into working with tinting, transparency, and gradients.